The introduction raises a question about two permanent institutions in human life: political communities and families. There is obviously some sort of relationship between these two things. Democracies generally have democratic families. Oligarchies generally have oligarchic families. The idea of justice that informs a political community also informs the family. So there is a fatal circle around what you can expect from a family in any particular political community that is determined by that political community's nature, by its understanding of justice. We live in a democracy that is becoming increasingly, embraces the idea of individual rights increasingly. So coming up with a defense of the family within that fatal circle of a modern democracy is a great challenge. And partly, this introduction lays out the ways in which our political community challenges the family life, and also points to the way in which the family can also challenge the political community. And that's the task of the book as a whole, is to lay out how defending the family can pose a challenge to an individualistic democracy. It is tricky defining modern feminism. I think it has two key elements. First, the divorce of sex from gender, or the belief that the body does not determine or shape human identity. And the second element is a moral element that honors a certain kind of woman who the feminists call the independent woman. Now, each of these elements points to the abolition of marriage and family life. Among the radical feminists who embrace this are Simone de Beauvoir and Shuli Firestone, both of whom recognize that marriage and family life compromise individual independence and presume the body shapes identity. So they embrace the idea that feminism demands the abolition of the family. Now, very few feminists would say this today, but my reading of that is that those are what I call retail feminists, feminists who just embrace the next step toward what these visionary feminists outlined. And because they lack a limiting principle, very few retail feminists would ever resist the abolition of the family. Contemporary liberalism is the view that the state should not take sides in moral controversies. When it comes to marriage and family life, this means that the state cannot take a side in whether or not a marriage should last, that the state should not take a side whether marriage should be man-woman or man-man or woman-woman. And ultimately, for contemporary liberalism, it means the state cannot take a side on whether or not people should marry and enter family life. Since marriage and family life require an environment supported by law and opinions, contemporary liberalism itself points toward the abolition of marriage and the family life. Many contemporary liberal thinkers embrace it explicitly and recommend that the family be replaced with what are called intensive caregiving units, state-created institutions that will be registered with the state and supported by the state, where care is given from one to the other. Gone are biological basis for the family, and now the basis will be care. It is tempting to think of sexual liberation theory as just increasing tolerance for more lifestyles. But rather, it is a deeper worldview, and that worldview promises liberation at the end. The problem with human societies, according to sexual liberationists, is repression. People have not been allowed to follow their passions. If we can get rid of laws, expectations, and cultural mores, we can liberate human beings so that they can follow their sexual passions. And when they follow their sexual passions, sexual liberationists promise peace, prosperity, and the abolition of crime and war. The abolition of repression is the goal of these sexual liberationists. Is the feminist worldview true? Both science and common sense suggest that there are differences between men and women that are difficult, if not impossible, to eradicate from human life. We see, for instance, in sports that men are stronger, run faster than women, and they do this at the highest levels. This chapter goes through various aspects of the differences between men and women, beginning with differences in athleticism, but going to more important personality differences, differences in sexual desire, and differences in expectations for happiness that feminism can paper over but cannot erase, that feminism can reinterpret but not erase. And the point being that we are not just meaningless stuff that are subject to the human will, but rather there's a structure to human nature that cannot be eliminated. Is the contemporary liberal worldview true? Are states morally neutral? Evidence would suggest they're not morally neutral. When we pass civil rights laws, we do so in order to shape the minds and hearts of the citizen away from particular forms of discrimination and toward a different vision of how citizens should get along. The same is always true when it comes to marriage and family life. When we allow divorce, when we shape divorce toward no fault at-will divorce, we get more of it. The same is true when it comes to the consumption of pornography. You decriminalize or deregulate pornography and make it legal, you get more consumption of pornography. Laws always reverberate through the culture, and contemporary liberalism denies that basic reality of political life. Is sexual liberation theory true? That question comes down to the question of repression. Are human beings repressed? Or is their repression a sign that they're trying to protect something deeply important to them? Is sex special? For sexual liberation theorists, sex is just one expression of human liberation. Whereas the traditional view is that human beings believe that they are protecting something special or even sacred in sexual relations. They are protecting the dignity of their own person. They're protecting the sanctity of relationships with people. They're protecting the ability to have children and perpetuate the species. The evidence that sexual liberationist theories bring forward dismisses every limit on sexual expression as repression, whereas it really is an expression of a deep human need for relations. If the rolling revolution gets the family wrong, how should we approach it? I suggest that there are two important things. We should always recognize that the family operates within a political environment, within a fatal circle, and shape family policy toward what our fatal circle is. In a modern liberal society, the promotion of the family should not be direct. It can only be indirect. We can encourage people to have children. We can't force them to have children. We can create an environment within which they will marry. We can't select their mates for them. And second, we want to create an environment, a moral environment that encourages choices toward marriage, never forcing, but never thinking that it's unimportant what people do with their private lives. Encouraging, not forcing. That's the liberal approach. So we want indirect policies and a good moral environment. How is a liberal political community going to handle conflicts over how people live their lives? We know that the promise of contemporary liberalism that the state should be neutral is a fool's errand. So how can the state handle different views of how sex should express itself, or whether or not, in this case, women should have children? These are conflicts over what a good life is. And a liberal society, if its laws aren't neutral, can't avoid them. What I try to do in this chapter is show that the framework of our current civil rights regime does not effectively deal with these conflicts, because it assumes that every inequality between gays and straights, or women with children and women without children, is a reflection of a deep prejudice against one or the other group. Those are not traceable to prejudice, but rather to different choices, to different natures, and different subcultures within our population. Another aspect of liberal theory is that legitimate relationships are established by consent. This seems to be a neutral way for the state to handle how people enter relationships. But there's a problem. Consent itself is an ambiguous concept. Does consent mean one-time consent or continuous consent? Does consent recognize that the environment around you limits your choice? Or must the environment around you be so constituted so that there's no limits on a choice? No, the kind of consent we embrace is itself a controversial thing. And this leads to vastly different understandings of the age of consent, vastly different understandings of when divorce is legitimate, and vastly different policies when it comes to prosecuting rape. This chapter investigates the controversy about consent and how it manifests itself in these policy areas. Chapter 11 takes a page out of Betty Friedan's book. It's called The New Problem with No Name, and that new problem with no name is the decline of marital character. This has two ways of expressing itself. The first is what I call pre-civilized decline of marital character, where people do not have long-term time horizons. They're fatalistic, they're hyper-masculine, and they cannot submit to the order of others or live with another human being. They don't rise to that level. You can see this in TV shows like The Wire or Justified, portrayed quite nicely. The second decline or lack of marital character is maybe hyper-civilized. That is, where people are think of themselves as so self-sufficient that they do not need the marriage for their own relations or for their own happiness. And one sees this especially in upper class families in America. Chapter 12 concerns dilemmas of indirection, where I apply the liberal theories that I mentioned earlier to particular policy areas. How can we encourage parental authority? We do that in a liberal society by protecting parental rights, which are powers that parents can exercise over their children without state interference. We also can create a moral environment for the translation of natural sexual desires to marital choices. This comes up in issues like pornography. If pornography is loose in our moral environment, it's less likely that sexual desire will be translated into marital choices. So shaping the moral environment means rolling back the freedom of pornographers. In the conclusion, I present some of the cliches that the rolling revolutionaries have sewn into our language and our lives, and provide responses to them with cliches of my own. But the central teaching of the conclusion is that the promise of the rolling revolution is that the achievement of human independence, or what I call human autonomy, will lead human beings to happiness. That is the promise of the rolling revolution. But 50 years of that revolution put a knife to that promise. Autonomy is not a necessary or sufficient condition for human happiness. And therefore, the rolling revolution greatest compromise to human life is that it immiserates human beings, makes them unhappy, because it is such a poor reflection on our nature.